Hello, and welcome to this presentation of the Paterno Castle, deep dive into New York City's famed Gilded Age mansion, where we will explore a comprehensive analysis of Dr. Paterno's castle. You might be wondering why I am so fascinated with the Paterno Castle. The family you see on this screen is the Paterno family, 2 parents, and their 10 children. Third from the left is Dr. Charles V. Paterno, my great-grandfather. He had 1 son, my grandfather, Carlo, who had 3 daughters, of which one is my mother. I am completely spellbound by my great-grandparents' castle and my grandfather's childhood home. The Paterno family came to New York City from Castelmezzano, where you see the red pin on the map, which is a small, it was impoverished mountain village in southern Italy. First, Papa Giovanni, who changed his name to John, arrived in 1880, and then 5 years later, Mama Carolina and their 4 eldest children followed. The 6 younger children were born in Manhattan, where they lived. Castelmezzano, translating roughly to castle in the middle, was the first castle in Dr. Paterno's life. The Castle Garden Emigrant Landing Depot was Charles's second castle in his life. His mother, siblings, and he passed through Castle Garden in 1885 upon their arrival. The humble family lived in Lower Manhattan at 220 Mott Street, laboring at various jobs, including construction, sewing, selling newspapers, and delivering groceries to provide for their food and housing. Charles showed early academic talents and was steered toward higher education. In 1899, he graduated with the first graduating class from the newly formed Medical College of Cornell University. But Charles was not destined to ever practice medicine. While working on his early entrepreneurial construction projects, Papa John unexpectedly died at the young age of 48. The unfinished construction projects, 2 6-story apartment houses, were funded by family savings and had to be finished. Son Joseph, who was only 18 years old and apprenticing with his father, took over the job and recruited his older brother Charles, who was just 21 years old. This slide shows the family in mourning in 1900. A photo of Papa John sits on the table in the middle. The 2 brothers, Joseph and Charles, completed their father's projects and sold them. As partial payment, they accepted an empty lot and built another 6-story apartment house. This was the beginning of the Paterno Brothers Construction Company and the Paterno family building legacy. Eventually, all 5 brothers and all 5 husbands of the 5 sisters worked together to continue and grow what Papa John had started. Together, the family built a total of 164 buildings in Manhattan from 1896 to 1964. 155 of those were apartment buildings, 4 were family homes, 1 a garage, now condo, 1 theater, 1 university cultural center, 1 tiny steel house, and, the reason why we are together now, 1 castle. Only 14 of the 164 buildings have been demolished. Sadly, this includes the castle. By the time Charles broke ground on his castle in 1907, the family had built only 22 buildings. In 1906, Dr. Charles Vincent Paterno and Minnie Minton Walcott Middaugh married in a private civil service. She was his Anglo-Dutch queen, and he was determined to build for her an appropriate home. By 1907, the Paterno family had built apartment houses on the west side of Manhattan as high as 116th Street, the Fort Washington area around 181st Street, along the Hudson River was still quite rural and dotted with grand estates. Fort Washington Point, circled in red on both maps, had captured Dr. Paterno's eye for its position and view along the river. Today, this is where the George Washington Bridge connects. Zooming in on the 1776 map on the left, you can see Fort Washington Point, Jeffrey's Hook, and the star-shaped Fort Washington, which was positioned strategically on the highest point in Manhattan during the Revolutionary War. We will be focusing on the area of land between the river and the fort, a bit north of Jeffrey's Hook, about where the word fort lands on the 1776 map. On the 1876 map on the right, we can see that this piece of land was owned by Charles Matthew Connolly and his son C.M. Connolly Jr. We're going to focus on Connolly Sr.'s land between the wide pink road, which would first be known as Boulevard Lafayette and then become Riverside Drive, between there and the short outlined road under the IN of Washington, which would first be known as Northern Avenue and then become Cabrini Boulevard. This is Charles Matthew Connolly Sr.'s house on his estate in the Fort Washington area, which would become known as Washington Heights because of its elevation over the Hudson River. As many estates do over time, the Connolly property was divided. We saw in 1867 Connolly Jr. and Connolly Sr.'s land. We'll label those 1 and 2. By 1900, Connolly Jr.'s land was intact, but Connolly Sr., who died in 1869, his land was divided. We'll label those 2A and 2B. By 1905, the land parcel labeled 2B had been divided again into 2 pieces. Many articles have stated that Dr. Paterno purchased the land for his castle in 1905. It is quite possible, but as of yet, I have found no hard documentation. Dr. Paterno and his architect, John C. Watson, filed for a new building permit on September 14, 1907. Ground was broken on November 23, 1907, the same day that Dr. Paterno's son, Carlo, was born. Very little is known about architect John C. Watson, who designed only a handful of theaters and garages besides one castle. It is suspected that Charles was the actual castle designer, and John was a relatively inexpensive licensed architect hired to draft and submit the architectural drawings to the city buildings superintendent. By 1911, the Paterno Castle appears on a map on this parcel of land for the first time. The land, labeled 2B, has now been divided into 3 sections. The Hardin House was built at 188 Northern Avenue in 1902. The Kingsley House was built at 184 Northern Avenue in 1905. And the Paterno Castle was built at 182 Northern Avenue in 1907, cozied right up next to the neighbor. The photo on the upper right shows the Hardin House and Kingsley House from Riverside Drive before Dr. Paterno built his castle. You may have wondered why Dr. Paterno's castle was built so very close to the Kingsley House next door. In 1907, when the castle project was started, Dr. Paterno owned only a portion of the land seen in the previous slide. Here's a sketch from the actual building permit file in John C. Watson's handwriting, indicating the approximate position of the square building on the pink plot. This schematic was stamped by the Bureau of Building of the City of New York for the Borough of Manhattan on September 14, 1907. A 1907 New York Tribune article reports that Paterno's parcel measured 80 feet by 264 feet, which is accurate for two sides of a lopsided parallelogram. This was certainly to be a stately castle of which its land would need to expand to match. The expansion would certainly come, as we will see. On this 1913 map, we can see the original Connolly Jr. estate labeled as 1. Connolly Sr.'s former property is labeled as 2A and 2B, with 2B further divided up into 3 lots. 2A is where Connolly Sr.'s house once stood, and according to this 1913 map, it has been demolished. Sometime between 1907 and 1913, Dr. Paterno purchased the plot to the south of the castle, on which he built a small garage. The estate had begun its expansion. Without blueprints of the castle, which I am determined to find, we must rely heavily on information from maps, newspaper and journal articles, and first-hand eyewitness accounts. All of these sources will be a part of this presentation. From this map, we can learn the basic shape of the castle and know that it is fireproof, denoted by the brown color according to the map legend. The blue outline denotes stone. In this case, it was white marble. The Kingsley house next door is primarily yellow, which denotes wooden construction, and the Hardin house was constructed primarily of brick, denoted by the color pink. The castle was 3 stories with a basement, denoted by the 3B on the map's drawing. We can clearly see the upper 3 stories in the photo, with the basement obviously underground. Before we dive deeper into this castle analysis, let's meet those who will help us get to know the Paterno residents with their eyewitness accounts. Before Minnie married Charles in 1906, she married Rufus Brown in 1889. Her son Lyndon Brown was born in 1892. Lyndon and his wife Ruth Marie had 3 children, seen in the photo on the left. The eldest child, Ruth, who was circled in this image, was very close to her grandmother Minnie and spent much time at the castle. Lucky for us, Ruth wrote about the castle in her diary, the details of which will help us understand the interior layout. Secondly, my grandfather Carlo, shown here with Minnie, wrote a memoir for his family and documented details about the castle, his childhood home, that are valuable to our understanding of its design. Lyndon and Carlo were half-brothers separated by 15 years. Thirdly, Dr. Paterno's nephew Michael wrote a memoir in which he made a few notes about the castle that he visited on occasion. And lastly, Dr. and Mrs. Paterno commissioned Clement B. Davis to make a brag book of their home in 1930. There are 2 existing copies. The rough draft is at the New York Historical Society, and the final copy is in possession of a family member. Dr. and Mrs. Paterno provided Clement with the details of their home, so dates, descriptions, and photos from this book are used to understand the timeline and construction of the castle. This slide shows a couple of page images from the book and images of the book itself to convey its largeness. It was also used as a guest book, and the last 40 pages are filled with dated signatures of guests who visited the castle. Let's get back to the castle, and let's let little Carlo invite us into his home. That is Carlo standing just south of the porte cochere when he was about 4 or 5 years old. Can you imagine growing up in a castle on the Hudson River? The castle ground was broken the day he was born, and the castle was demolished when he was 31 years old. What might have inspired Dr. Paterno to build a castle instead of a different style of home for his family? Many historians say that he was inspired by castles along the Rhine River, a river that passes through Germany, France, Switzerland, and Austria. That may be so, but by 1907, when he broke ground, Dr. Paterno had made one known trip back to Italy in 1904 to pay respects to his father's resting place in southern Italy. Otherwise, he stayed hard at work building apartment houses in New York City and spent little time on the luxury of travel. There is no documentation that young Charles traveled the Rhine. He could have seen images in books, but I think a more plausible explanation can be found nearby. The Woodcliff Castle, also known as the Libby Castle, built in 1855, stood at approximately 194th Street on Fort Washington Avenue until 1931. I have indicated its location in the 178 section of the map. Look at these two castles side by side. Looking at them, I think Charles could not have been inspired, or at least influenced by the Woodcliff Libby Castle. It is said that the owner and builder of the Woodcliff Libby Castle designed it after a castle he saw in Austria. It is a myth that Dr. Paterno disassembled a castle in Europe and had it shipped to America for reassembly. The Paterno Castle was 3-story plus basement, so some say 4-story brick structure clad in white marble that measured 50 feet wide by 67 feet long. It has been reported to have had 35 to 38 rooms. The porte cochere and main entrance is on the east side, image A. We can tell these are early images of the castle because the glass house extension is not yet present on the south side, image C. The rock retaining wall is not yet present on the west side overlooking the river, image B. And we can see evidence of the neighboring houses on the north side in all 3 images. Most importantly, the pointed conical turret roof is present. Sometime between 1926 and 1933, the conical roof was removed and another round level was added to the turret's height, which we will see. Here are 3 more early images of the Paterno Castle with the conical roof, the neighboring Kingsley and Hardin houses, and no retaining wall. Here is a beautiful postcard that well depicts the Paterno Castle in the early years. The marble is white, the conical roof is red, and Riverside Drive is a dirt road. I believe this image well depicts Paterno Castle soon after Phase 1 was completed. We see the castle and the original garage on land positioned across the Hudson River from the cliffs of the New Jersey Palisades. The Kingsley house is next door, the conical roof is present, there is no ivy growth on the walls, and there are no iron gates nor marble pillars along Northern Avenue. This is Charles's 3rd castle in his life. From poor Castelmezzano, Italy, through Castle Garden Emigration Depot in 1885, to his castle home on the Hudson, shown here around 1910, a time which marked the tail end of New York City's Gilded Age. The basement pedestal upon which the castle sits has walkways on the south and north sides, which you can see well in this photograph. There appear to be stairs on the south side, ostensibly to reach the basement. Here is a close-up of the original garage taken from the castle. It's a stately little structure itself. This 1908 article tells us that the parcel of land upon which Dr. Paterno was building his castle, it refers to the construction still being underway, measured 80 by 275 feet from Riverside Drive to Northern Avenue and reached 125 feet above the Hudson River. We are informed that this slope of the Fort Washington Ridge is solid rock a few feet below the surface, which fully supports the castle. Now, this is where we are going to bust a long-standing myth about Paterno Castle. The article tells readers that from Riverside Drive there will be 15 steps to a landing ornamented with a fountain. From this landing will be steps to the left and to the right, which will lead to the first terrace, from which a 75-foot tunnel will strike directly into the side of the hill and extend to a point under the center of the castle in the basement. It's reported here that in the basement is a culinary mushroom vault, a wine cellar, a Turkish bath with dressing rooms, 2 hot rooms of different temperatures, massage rooms, a swimming pool, a grill room, a lounging room, a kitchen, and sleeping quarters for the domestic workers. Why mushrooms of all things, you might ask? In 1907, culinary mushrooms were selling for $1.50 a pound. That converts to almost $50 a pound today. Do I really think Dr. Paterno actually grew culinary mushrooms in the basement of his castle? I actually do think it was very likely, based on the 1933 blueprints for his farm estate greenhouses in Westchester County, north of the city. Those drawings featured a mushroom cellar, so it seems that Dr. Paterno was indeed fond of and in the practice of growing mushrooms. But that's not the myth I'm looking to bust. The illustrations from this 1908 New York Times article have been circulated as post-construction facts, although it was written during construction. As often as the Paterno Castle was photographed, I have yet to see one photo with this extravagant entrance from Riverside Drive. Perhaps the Riverside entrance was an initial concept, but that was never executed. The image on the right is a photograph from the November 5th, 1916 issue of the Tribune Graphic, almost 9 years after breaking ground. Still, there is no Riverside Drive stair, terrace, or tunnel entrance. It is documented, which we will discuss, that the rock retaining wall on the riverside that still partially exists today was started in 1921. Between 1916, the date of this publication, and 1921, I feel confident in saying that this elaborate riverside entrance was never constructed. It is a persistent myth, and I am here to bust it. However, there is a little structure that I've circled in yellow. The 1908 New York Times article stated that beneath the Italian garden on the south side of the castle would be an underground passage to be known as the service tunnel. This would be reached by a short flight of steps from Northern Avenue and would lead directly into the kitchen and servants' quarters in the basement. This may be that. The exciting news is that we know there was indeed a swimming pool in the basement. That much is true. A 1911 New York Times article tells us that this hall, denoted by red arrows on the castle map drawing and the photograph on the right, contained an illuminated pool which was an iron tank covered with enameled brick, measuring 20 feet long, 9 feet wide, and 12 feet deep. Mind you, today most pools are 6 to 8 feet deep. So this was a very deep pool. It is reported that Dr. Paterno's swimming pool was filled with filtered water from the Hudson River. The photo on the left from this newspaper article shows one of the windows overlooking the river from inside the basement swimming pool hall. Note the corresponding circled window in the photo on the right. Here is a photo of the indoor pool in the basement hall from the 1911 newspaper article. You can see the pool indicated in the cross-section drawing on the right from the 1908 article. From Ruth Brown's diary, we know that there was a utility staircase to the basement where there was a kitchen, a lounge, dining room, and sleeping quarters for the domestic workers. Let's move up to the first floor. The porte cochere is the main entrance point of the castle on Northern Avenue. The two photos are looking north. The photo on the left is an earlier photo, we can tell, by the lush landscape still intact in the background. I suspect these were trees between the castle and the Kingsley house next door. The photo on the right shows the land cleared. In fact, one can see in the distance Dr. Paterno's sister's house on Chittenden Avenue, which was built in 1921. Also, the ivy growing on the marble is much more established in this photo. Without blueprints and practically no interior photos, the layout of the castle is guesswork. I have compiled the written accounts of granddaughter Ruth Brown, son Carlo Paterno, and nephew Michael Paterno, along with the Castle Bragg book and newspaper articles to piece together a rough estimate of how the interior was arranged. According to Ruth, the front door had red carpeting running out under the double grill-covered glass doors down the 2 steps to the driveway. Inside the foyer were 2 knights of armor figures and chairs and tables of Italian design. Here we can see on the left a Bragg book photo taken from inside the entrance looking through those double grill-covered glass doors. And on the right, we see Dr. Paterno and his son Carlo standing at those 2 steps, perhaps a red carpet on top of the 2nd step, and faintly the ornate grillwork on the door. Carlo wrote, "As you entered the castle from the porte cochere, there was a Japanese card room on the right." Ruth wrote that there was a ladies' sitting room and adjoining powder room next to the Japanese card room. According to Ruth, the library had a circular glass window at one end, and in front of the furniture lay a beautiful tiger rug stretched out on the floor. Carlo recorded that the library was finished in dark oak and overstuffed blue velvet furniture. Dr. Paterno's nephew Michael wrote that the elevator located on the north side was designed to travel from the basement to the roof level. The photo on the left shows the square elevator tower on the north side of the castle. It reached 5 levels from the roof to 3 interior floors and down to the basement. It was an electric Otis elevator. The photo on the right, if you look closely, shows a doorway from the elevator tower to access the roof. If you didn't notice already, these are later photos of the castle. The conical roof is gone, and a second layer of the round turret has been added. Ruth wrote that there was an open area with long windows separating the library from the music room. Here were the grand piano, the French furniture, and a beautiful lion rug on the floor. Carlo said the music room contained 18th century French gilded furniture. This may or may not be one of 2 possible photos taken inside the castle. This photo comes from the New York City chapter of the American Guild of Organists, which states that James Lewis took this photo in 1913 to showcase the organ installed in the castle by the Aeolian Company. The organ was installed in stages from the basement to the 2nd floor to become an Opus 1174 electro-pneumatic action organ with 3 manuals, 60 registers, 44 stops, 50 ranks, and 3,097 pipes. It has been said that at one time the organ was connected to a clock and would play automatically at certain times of the day. Minnie Paterno was an accomplished musician. Between her 2 marriages, she lived in Washington, D.C. with her brother. She played one of the 7 pianos in the John Philip Sousa military band. She also played piano for the Washington Symphony Orchestra. The reason why I think this photo could be of the Paterno-Cappiello music room is that if the Aeolian Company sent over a photographer to document the organ, it seems likely that they would identify it correctly with date and location. The reason why I think this photo may not be of the Paterno-Cappiello music room is that the furniture is certainly not 18th century French gilded furniture. Perhaps the furniture remembered by Ruth and Carlo was from later years after this furniture was replaced. The red arrow on the photo on the right would indicate the general location of the music room next to the elevator tower and the curved wall of windows in the library. If this is indeed the music room, the double glass door would have to be the one indicated in the photo on the right, which is zoomed in where the red arrow was pointing in the previous slide. The doors on the left look like they are 3 panes of glass across. The doors on the right look to me to be more narrow with 2 panes of glass across. There was certainly an organ, left photo, and a piano, right photo, in the room. These may be the long windows separating the library from the music room about which Ruth wrote. And the last clue we can take from this room is a set of stairs. The winding staircase was recorded by both Ruth and Carlo. Ruth wrote that once the castle was entered from the front door, further down the foyer one entered an octagonal-shaped center room in the middle of the castle with a fountain and goldfish pond in the middle with Italian furniture on the outer walls. Carlo wrote that as one proceeded from the fountain, the winding stairway came down from the second floor with a powder room underneath and the music room beyond. Ruth wrote that at the grand staircase, you will see that you can look straight up to the glass roof. Nephew Michael wrote that one entered the castle into a sizable vestibule with a decorative marble fountain. The vestibule led to a large hall from which one could see the winding stairway going up to the second floor. Behind the stairway was the music room and library on one side, and on the other side, the dining room and kitchen. Let's try to make sense of these recollections and see if they match up to this photo. If this image shows the octagonal-shaped center room in the middle of the castle, then the music room is actually just the back section that contains the organ and the piano. The ceiling tray is indeed octagonal, and the atrium opening is rectangular. Here are images of the top of the castle. You can see the square skylight that illuminates the 3-story atrium. It appears to me to be east of the square elevator tower or in line with it. If the music room adjoined the library, the music room and atrium would be west of the elevator. Here's one more possibility. Perhaps the music room was in the back of the castle. Perhaps the double glass doors in the music room are the double glass doors we can faintly see under the arch on the back of the home. So if we're looking from the foyer of the castle into the octagonal room with the music room behind it, we are certainly missing the marble fountain and grand winding staircase said to be here under the skylight. This is why I can't say for certain if this photo is actually of the Paterno-Cappiello music room. We won't know for sure until the castle blueprints are found. Let's add to our drawing here a center corridor that contains the foyer, staircase, and fountain, though we're not certain of their arrangements. Added to is a blue skylight in a best guess location. We have an accidental photo of the living room. When the glass house extension was added in 1927, It was appended to the dining room. In the pink drawing, we see the corridor which leads to the conservatory kissed onto the dining room. We know it's the dining room because a photo was taken standing in that corridor facing the castle, and we can see a set dining table and chairs. Carlos said that opposite the fountain was the Italian decorated dining room with the round mahogany table and cherub frescoing. Ruth said that to the left of the octagonal foyer was the dining room, which was very formal and done in dark wood. Nephew Michael said that the music room and library were on one side of the stairway and on the other, the dining room and kitchen. I believe this was the serving kitchen or butler pantry, and that the main cooking kitchen was in the basement, as previously mentioned when talking about the swimming pool. Ruth Brown wrote that there was a dumbwaiter that brought food up from the basement kitchen to the upper 3 floors and roof. On the first floor, she said there were heating ovens, china cabinets, and a sink. From here, she said, there was a door to the outside terrace. Remember, the roof of the swimming pool hall made a terrace off the back of the first floor of the castle. I suspect that in the back square tower was the dumbwaiter and a set of service stairs. Ruth wrote about taking the back servants' stairway to go downstairs underground to the cooking kitchen, servants' lounge, dining room, and sleeping quarters. And lastly, coming back to the front of the castle, we have a parlor or living room that was said to be decorated in a Louis XV style. The small black X in the square between the dining room and the parlor is the chimney. There was a fireplace on the exterior wall of the dining room. This fireplace and chimney will come into play again in 1927 when Dr. Paterno adds the glass house extension. Keep in mind that my circles represent an estimated proximity of rooms rather than actual room sizes. This is all guesswork until the blueprints are recovered. Let's head up to the second floor, which is where all the bedrooms were located. Ruth wrote, the second story has a red velvet balustrade running around the entire second floor and also the third floor. Back to the stairway. You walk up 3 red carpeted stairs and continue as the stairs turn right for the full flight to the second floor, or else take the elevator up to the second or third floor. As we reach the second floor, we will notice organ pipes in the left corner. We walk to the first door and we enter a large foyer. A closet on the left houses my grandmother's shoes, dozens of them in all colors. The next door in the foyer area leads into my grandfather's room, dark masculine with a large fireplace. Leaving that room and going into the doorway across from the foyer door is a very large white bathroom with a sunbathing deck outside, which is above the porte cochere. All of the commodes in the bathrooms in the castle are covered with white wicker chairs. We know that since Ruth placed the sunbathing deck over the porte cochere, that Dr. and Mrs. Paterno's bedrooms were at the front or east side of the castle facing Northern Avenue. The master suite measured approximately 20 by 18 feet, not 20 by 80 feet, as was often misreported. The castle was only 67 feet in length and 50 feet wide, and remember the plot of original land was only 80 feet wide. Ruth wrote of the red velvet balustrade and 3 red carpeted stairs. We go back to the music room photo and see perhaps evidence of these. We definitely see the organ pipes on the second floor as Ruth documented. Ruth goes on to write, "The next room off the foyer area is my grandmother's boudoir, with a bed, daybed, chairs, small piano, fireplace, and a room for the family to gather in and for me to sleep on the daybed whenever I spent the night when I was little." This photo of Mrs. Minnie Paterno, my great-grandmother, and Ruth's grandmother may have been taken in the boudoir Ruth described. That may well be, next to her desk, the very daybed in which Ruth slept. The bedroom fireplaces may have been decorative, as there are no chimneys aligned with them. The castle was heated by a Fitzgibbon steel boiler, as documented by this advertisement. Ruth continues, "A second door from the boudoir led into a little hall with a back stairway going down the pantry, and through the hall was a good-sized sewing room. Remember, on the first floor, the serving kitchen is next to the square tower with the dumbwaiter, which tells us that the hallway and Minnie Paterno's boudoir are on the south side of the castle. Castle descriptions have mentioned a nursery upstairs as well as a maid's room. Perhaps the nursery was next to Minnie's room, and when Carlo outgrew it, the room became a maid's chamber. In the 1910 U.S. Census, it was listed an English governess living at the castle address. Little Carlo was born in 1907, so that makes perfect sense. Ruth wrote, "Beyond that was a large bathroom belonging to my Uncle Carlo, and then his room, which had a circular area surrounded by glass windows. This room also had entrance by a door from around the second floor balcony. Walk a little further to a large walk-in cedar closet, and then a few feet further, a door opens into a small foyer area. I can only guess, based on Ruth's account, that my grandfather Carlo's bedroom included the area of the round turret as part of a suite that included his bathroom, cedar closet, and foyer." Based on Ruth's description, Carlo's bedroom had a circular area surrounded by glass windows, and the two guest rooms had balconies overlooking the Hudson. That would place the guest rooms here. This is a rough estimate of the second floor layout. One unresolved discrepancy is that Carlo wrote that once he became of school age, he had his own room on the second floor in the southwest portion's overview of the Great Hudson River. This leads me to believe that he was perhaps in the nursery next to his mother's room until he was moved into his suite. But if Carlo's room had been in the southwest rather than the northwest corner of the castle, he would have been sleeping on a dumbwaiter based on what we know so far. We have many clues, but without photographs or blueprints, it's all still guesswork. Remember that Ruth said the red velvet balustrade is present again on the third floor, and the roof skylight illuminates the interior of the castle through the 3-story atrium. On the third floor was a 50-square-foot banquet hall or ballroom with a 20-foot ceiling. Ruth wrote that besides the ballroom, there was a full dining room, serving kitchen, and powder room. Exterior balconies from the third floor offered breathtaking views of the Hudson River. Carlo remembers the third floor as a large ballroom for parties and dancing. Ruth wrote that leaving the second floor, one went up and entered the grand ballroom with the grand piano. The ceiling was covered with frescoes, the walls lined with velvet chairs, wrote Ruth, and mirrors covered the sides of the rooms. Here we can see those third floor balconies for gazing out over the Hudson River. A 1913 newspaper article wrote about Mrs. Paterno hosting a party. Mentioned is the center fountain with goldfish on the first floor. After the reception there, her guest went up to the third floor ballroom where there was dancing and refreshments. It goes on to report that the conservatories on the roof garden were used for resting places between the dances. This is where we finally have an explanation for this rectangular structure on the roof. This was a glass structure on top of the castle used for parties. Host and guest could access the roof by the elevator, and the domestic workers could access the roof through the stair and dumbwaiter tower. The photo on the left shows a glass roof peeking out over the marble roof wall or parapet, and it notes the placement of the single chimney, though there were several fireplaces throughout the house, most probably decorative. The photo on the right shows with red arrows those structures on the east and north sides meeting in the corner. From this vantage point, you can see the doorway from the dumbwaiter tower at the yellow arrow. The blue arrow indicates the skylight. The castle construction started in November of 1907. The two-story brick and stone garage seen on the left of this photo was constructed in 1908. On June 21, 1908, the Paterno family, Charles, Minnie, and Carlo, moved into their new home before it was totally complete. According to the Bragg book, the castle was completed in 1909. Newspaper articles from 1911 and 1913 describe it as still under construction. Some say it wasn't complete until 1916. Honestly, I don't think it was ever really finished, as Dr. Paterno kept building upon his original vision until he demolished his castle in 1938. A 1913 article from The Sun reports that the iron railing and marble columns are in place along Northern Avenue, which we can see in this postcard with the garage in the foreground. This illustration also well depicts the rooftop glass conservatory. Here is a photo from the same time period with the marble columns and iron fencing and gate. The rooftop conservatory is looking reflective in this image. This January 6, 1918 New York Times article announces that Dr. Paterno purchased the Kingsley house next door. I haven't found a date yet as to when Dr. Paterno purchased the Hardin house. In 1919, Dr. Paterno purchased large segments of the former James Gordon Bennett estate in order to protect the development around his castle. The property north of the former Hardin house, marked on the 1913 and 1919 maps as green block number 1, becomes his, as well as the lot blocks number 2 and number 3. On the 1919 map, Dr. Paterno had already acquired the land in block number 4 by 1918. Never one to sit idle, Dr. Paterno, with his new land acquisition, came up with a bigger plan. Dr. Paterno started working on his riverside retaining wall in 1921, but it wasn't until 1923 when he filed a new building permit for the Hudson View Gardens apartment complex did the wall really start to rise. During construction of Hudson View Gardens across Northern Avenue from his castle on the former Bennett property, about 100,000 cubic yards of rock were taken off the property during construction site excavation and used in formation of the retaining wall. This slide shows sections of 3 different 1922 newspaper articles. They all used the same photo but had different captions. Notice that the pergola, which is an arbor formed of horizontal trellis work, supported on columns or posts over which vines or other plants grow. It is not present yet on the top of the wall, and that is the castle conical roof. The castle conical roof is still in place at this time. This photo is clearly of the castle in later years, as the conical roof is gone. Dr. Paterno had acquired the land south of his castle, we've seen as labeled 2A, where the senior Connolly's house once stood. Dr. Paterno started with one of 4 lots of Section 2B, then acquired all of 2B, acquired green block number 1, and added 2A to his castle estate. He would own roughly from 182nd to 186th Streets between Riverside Drive and Northern Avenue. The castle estate topped out at approximately 7.5 acres. The 70-foot tall retaining wall was approximately 550 feet long, not 1,000 feet, as is often misreported, from the north end of the Hardin property at 2B to the south end of Section 2A. He didn't do anything with the land labeled green block number 1 until 1938. The Castle Bragg book states that the retaining wall was finished in 1925. The pergola atop the wall seems to have been added in 1928. Note that the 2 round overlooks in the pergola walkway align with the location of the castle. Ruth Brown, who lived at the Hudson View Gardens, wrote that as a teenager in 1937, when her cousin came to visit from California, her grandmother's chauffeur took them down through the servants' quarters in the castle basement to a secret door. They went through an unfinished part of the cellar where they walked on gangplanks and walked out to the stone retaining wall overhanging Riverside Drive and looked out over the small cars below. Here is a photo from the 1930 Castle Bragg book of Carlo, Minnie, and Charles Paterno enjoying the pergola. The photo on the right is taken from the northernmost round overlook on the pergola looking south over Riverside Drive, the new Henry Hudson Parkway, and the new George Washington Bridge. This is an early photograph of Hudson View Gardens shortly after construction was completed. Construction began in 1923, so this is probably 1925. The castle still has its conical roof, and the Kingsley and Hardin houses are still present. Here is a photo from roughly the same time, taken from a 6-story Hudson View Gardens apartment overlooking the 4-story apartments in the same complex with the Paterno, former Kingsley, and former Hardin residences in place. You can well see the glass conservatory on the castle roof. This is a 1925 map. We see the Hudson View Gardens apartment complex across Northern Avenue from the castle. We still see the Kingsley and Hardin houses. The blue border encompasses Dr. Paterno's land. I had to merge 2 map pages to create this image. Doing so covered up the handwritten note on the section of property we've known as 2B. The note reads, Dr. Paterno's estate. It's accurate to note that the land for Hudson View Gardens was never part of the actual castle estate, as has been sometimes misreported. By 1925, Dr. Paterno owned all of this land, had built the retaining wall, and had constructed Hudson View Gardens. What was next? Here is a postcard that Minnie wrote to her son Carlo. It's dated 1926. He was 19 and probably away at college. We can still see the tip of the conical roof and the former Kingsley house next door. There is nothing on the south side of the castle. It was in 1927 when Dr. Paterno filed a new building permit to add a glass house extension to the south side of his castle. This 1927 map shows the former Hardin and former Kingsley houses and the original Paterno garage still present. We also see on the south side of the castle a large glass house extension and 2 new garages. What is extraordinary about this part of the presentation is that I have many interior and exterior photos and original blueprints to share with you. We know exactly how the Paternos intended to use this major addition to their home. Here is a wonderful aerial photograph of the Paterno Castle estate taken on March 25th, 1934. It shows the main castle with the conical roof removed, the retaining wall and pergola, the major glass house extension, the original garage removed, and the 2 new garages on the south end. We can also see the 2 rows of Hudson View Gardens across Northern Avenue. Both the former Hardin and Kingsley houses are gone. Dr. Paterno wouldn't develop the land north of the castle estate, acquired from the Bennett land sale, until 1938 when he demolished the castle. Let's explore the glass house extension, which will require a lot less guesswork than the main castle. Here is the master plan for the glass house extension. You can see that each section or house is assigned a number from 1 to 29. On the north end of the extension, we can see where it is attached to the residence, where we've already seen when we saw the photograph peeking into the dining room. Note that the overall dimension is marked 300 feet. That is 6 times as wide as the castle. This was no small addition. Here are the 2 architectural elevations of the glass house extension. The east elevation is from the vantage point of Northern Avenue. The castle would be on the right. The west elevation is from the vantage point of the Hudson River. The castle would be on the left. Let's look at houses 1 and 2. Ruth Brown wrote, "Off the dining room, doors opened into a long, heated, tile floor glasshouse section with flowers growing on each side at waist level." The photo on the left is what you would see leaving the dining room and entering the glass house extension. The photo on the left shows from the exterior houses 1 and 2, with number 3 being the conservatory, which we will see next. The photo on the right was taken standing in the conservatory and looking back at house 2 with house 1 and the dining room in the distance. Here is Dr. Paterno sitting in the conservatory. The entrance is through the pointed hallway on the right in the photo. Dr. Paterno was the driving force behind all of these plants which he loved. It has been said that he always wore an orchid or gardenia blossom in his jacket lapel. Carlo recalls the Capehart Victrola that was located in the conservatory. It automatically changed records and would play continuously for several hours and was used for the Sunday open house, tea, swim, and dance parties that his mother hosted. Ruth remembers entering this huge solarium with a glass roof, carpets over tile floors, and large stone fireplace, and a dozen hanging bird cages with canaries and potted plants everywhere. This was a favorite room to entertain in, as it always had bright light compared to the darker rooms of the castle. The plan for the conservatory is on the right. Dr. Paterno is sitting just east of the number 3. On the west side, we see a large round protrusion, and on the south side, we see a fireplace. Here is the fireplace from a page in the Castle Bragg book and a family portrait taken in front of the fireplace. The Bragg book tells that a fireplace was removed from the castle dining room when the glass house extension was connected. Carlo wrote that the fireplace in the conservatory was one of Dad's innovations, as there was no chimney for smoke and heat to escape. He devised a large fan so that the smoke actually went under the floor in the conservatory and up the main chimney of the castle. He did this for aesthetic reasons, as he did not want the chimney to block the view through the beautiful glass dome. The chimney that Carlo mentioned was the one we saw situated between the dining room and the parlor in the main castle on the first floor, denoted by a black X. Note the double doors behind Carlo. We will see their other side in just a moment. The photo on the left is of the round protrusion on the west side of the conservatory, and the photo on the right was taken from the west side facing the east wall with another view of the fireplace. We have exited the conservatory by the stairs you see on the left and entered the billiard room, house number 4. The double doors were the ones we saw behind Carlo in the family portrait by the fireplace. This section is 2 stories. We'll get to the underneath momentarily. Ruth remembers the billiard room being outfitted with a very heavy pool table, dome lights, cues, racks, and high stools to watch the game. From the billiard room, which is house number 4, we'll go straight to explore the iron and glass greenhouses, all 17 of them. House number 5, next to the billiard room, is the orchid house. The concentric squares in this house represent the stepped cedar benches for the many orchids. House number 6 is the gardenia house. House number 7 is a carnation house. House number 8 is a rose house. House 9 is a workroom. And house 29 next door is the service house where one of the many resident workers lived. The 1930 federal census listed Charles, Minnie, and Carlo as residents of 182 Northern Avenue. Additionally, there was 1 German houseman, 2 butlers, 1 Italian and 1 German, 3 maids, 1 English, 1 Swedish, and 1 Irish, 2 chauffeurs, 1 from Ohio, his Irish wife and their son, and another from Italy with his wife and daughter, an English carpenter, his Irish wife and their son, a Japanese personal maid and her daughter, 3 gardeners, 1 from Poland, 1 from England, and 1 from Germany, an Irish fireman, 2 florists, 1 from Sweden and 1 from England with his wife, and an overseer from Scotland with his wife's son, daughter, and grandson. That is 32 people living on the castle estate, of which 17 were employees. The 1910 and 1920 census records each showed 7 employees. With the expansion of land and buildings, the staff grew. Houses number 4 through 9 are the upper floor of a 2-story structure. We'll go downstairs shortly. Back to the billiard room, which is house number 4. West of that, we see house number 28, which was the Palm House. House 27 was the Conifer House. Number 14, 15, and 16 were the potted fruit houses. 17 and 18 were dedicated to bulbs. House number 20 was a rose house. 19 was a carnation house. 26 was the early grapery, and 27 was the late grapery. 23 was the mum house, and house number 22 was for sweet peas. The greenhouses were all outfitted with heated trenches, plumbing for water and drains, and slate tables. Each was modified and calibrated for the specific needs of the specific plants. Here are 2 photos taken inside the greenhouses, though I'm not sure exactly which ones. If we go back to the billiard room and down the stairs, we entered directly underneath into an exercise room with a mechanical horse, ping pong table, and other exercise equipment, followed by the swimming pool house, which is under the first set of greenhouses next to the billiard room. Note the 2 doors on the back wall. The pool measures 60 feet by 80 feet, 3 times as long as the original pool in the castle basement, but not Olympic length as is often misreported. Ruth Brown wrote, "The pool was surrounded by rattan furniture along one long windowed wall, and the other wall had goldfish set in 4 glass aquariums in the wall. The pool had a diving board at one end, ropes for swinging on in the middle overhead, and had a beautiful blue tile bottom. Beyond the pool, there were dressing rooms on each side for the ladies and the men, with an assortment of bathing suits for their use, bathrooms for each, and beyond this, a very large health room with Turkish bath, massage table, and water hoses, all supervised by the engineer." If you exit the pool area and head into the left door, you'll enter the women's dressing room, for which you can see the floor layout in the upper image. If you head into the door on the right from the pool, you'll access the men's dressing room, complete with an electric sun bath. Additional rooms include a needle spray room, Turkish room, and a steam room. The east elevation drawing shows the billiard room above the exercise room with 4 windows and the long stretch of greenhouses on the upper floor, and the swimming pool room and dressing rooms on the lower floor, both abutted by the service house. The shorter glass section is the glassed-in greenhouse area behind the rattan furniture that we saw in the pool photo. You can see the underground indication of the swimming pool on the drawing. That is Dr. Paterno's complete castle estate. Here is the 1930 map, and for the first time we see the Hardin and Kingsley houses removed. All we know is that they were demolished sometime between 1925 and 1930. It appears that the glass house extension, the pergola atop the retaining wall, the 2 new garages, demolition of the original garage, demolition of the 2 neighboring houses, and the removal of the conical roof all happened around the same time. The photo on the left shows the Paterno Castle with the new George Washington Bridge under construction in the background. The conical roof on the northwest corner of the castle is in place. The photo on the right shows the original single deck of the bridge present, and the conical roof has now been replaced by an upper round section. The George Washington Bridge was started in September 1927 and opened to traffic in October 1931. My best guess is that the conical roof was removed between 1928 and 1930. The original material, perhaps wood shingles, may have been incompatible with the stone, whereby deteriorating. Now it's time to bust another stubborn myth. At the far north end of Dr. Paterno's estate, but not part of the estate, is a unique home called the Pumpkin House. It was not built by Dr. Paterno, and he never owned it. It is not a remnant of the Paterno estate, as is often misreported. It was built in 1923 for Cleveland Walcott, not Walcott, like Minnie Paterno's Connecticut family, and it still stands today. Before we identify actual remnants of the castle that remain today, we must face the demolition of the castle in 1938. Dr. Paterno had in his mind, even before the castle estate was complete and before the construction of Hudson View Gardens, the possibility of replacing his grand home with apartment houses. This was documented in a November 1922 New York Herald newspaper article. But before Dr. Paterno decided to demolish his home, his son Carlo was married at the castle. Here are Carlo and Helen, to me, Bobo and Grams, my maternal grandparents, on their wedding day, November 23rd, 1934, at the castle. To the left of the bride is 10-year-old Ruth Brown, whose diary notes have been instrumental in helping us know the castle. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle wrote, "The ceremony took place in the large glass conservatory, which had been transformed into an outdoor garden by means of silver birch trees and tropical and subtropical plants. After the ceremony, the bridal couple received the congratulations of relatives and friends in the third-floor ballroom. Later, there was dancing. A buffet supper was served in the conservatory. The entire paternal residence was thrown open for the festivities." This is supposed to be a video, and it's not. I apologize. But in the show notes, I will link for you the video where you can see this demolition. Alas, the castle is destroyed. It has been documented that Dr. Paterno felt that the property taxes had become too high and that he had invested, quote, several $million, unquote, in creating his dream home, which has gradually become a financial burden that he did not wish to place on the shoulders of his son Carlo. Additionally, Dr. Paterno was a successful apartment house builder, and he knew this property would make a premium location for new apartment houses. Dr. Paterno filed for a new building permit in 1938 to build these 5 13-story Castle Village apartment towers. You can see the retaining wall with the pergola intact. The 2 round overlooks, which aligned with the castle, are roughly in line with the building at 140 Cabrini Boulevard, which was formerly known as Northern Avenue. A June 14, 1960 newspaper photo stated that the reinforced concrete columns of the pergola were crumbling after decades of exposure to wind and rain and were being pulled down as a safety measure. The retaining wall ends just before the far side of the tower at 160 Cabrini. This is where the castle estate ended. Rather than extending a wall, Dr. Paterno constructed a mostly underground parking garage for the residents of Castle Village. This is the structure you can see on the riverside of buildings 180 and 200. Castle Village was the 4th castle in Dr. Paterno's life. Here is a recent screenshot from Google Earth of Castle Village. You can see the 5 towers housing 580 apartments and the white roof of the parking garage. Abutting the garage to the left is the pumpkin house under the letter G in Village. We can see the remaining retaining wall without the pergola. To the right of the first building, 120 Cabrini, you can see the 2 remaining garages that are part of Castle Village and have been converted into apartments. Behind Castle Village is Hudson View Gardens. Here is a closer look at the two remaining garage apartments, now fully converted apartments, on the south end of the property. This short section of the original estate iron fence and two marble columns still remain. The iron detail on either side of the gate is enlarged in the smaller photo at the top. Note the initial P in brass for Paterno on the very top. This is located on the Cabrini side of Castle Village. The bulk of the remaining iron fence was donated to a section of Fort Tryon Park around 192nd Street. The photo on the bottom is what remains at Castle Village. The top photo is the same style fencing now in place in the park. On the map, the section in red is the approximate location of the donated iron fence from Dr. Paterno's former castle estate. A section of the original retaining wall remains. In 2005, a portion of the wall collapsed. Fortunately, no one was injured. The wall was repaired, and it is evident now which part of the wall is old and which is new. Speaking of the wall, remember when teenager Ruth Brown went with her cousin and the chauffeur into the castle basement to a secret door, which led to an unfinished part of the cellar where they walked on gangplanks to the stone retaining wall and looked out over the small cars below? She may have peered through one of the three openings in the wall circled in yellow on the left side photo. That unfinished cellar may have served as this air raid shelter for Castle Village during World War II. The yellow arrow is pointing to none other than Dr. Paterno himself. A woman who grew up at Castle Village in the 1980s told me that she and other children would climb up the side of the retaining wall and go into the opening on the left side over the highway. She said that a tunnel would run parallel to the outside. She remembers a ladder going down that they wisely never went down, but could hear water at the bottom. When the wall collapsed in 2005, she said that most of the tunnel collapsed with it and has been sealed off. The mostly underground parking garage at Castle Village has a pedestrian entrance on one side, which you can see from above in the lower photo circled in yellow. The face of that entrance is photographed on the upper left. Some people like to say that this was the original porte cochere from the castle, but looking at these photos side by side, that doesn't seem to be the case. It is highly possible that the material for the pedestrian entrance was repurposed from the castle demolition. On the 160 Cabrini Tower, there is a 1939 plaque dedicated to Dr. Charles V. Paterno. It reads, "He loved the splendor of this site where he made his home a castle. In apartments he built, he lightened burdens with labor-saving conveniences and lifted the spirit with the beauty of gardens." And lastly, there is one more tribute to Dr. Paterno. You see Castle Village along Cabrini Boulevard, and you can see Hudson View Gardens along Pinehurst Avenue. Where the roads converge at 187th Street is now a trivium, a Latin word for a place where three roads meet. It is circled in yellow where bald asphalt once existed. In 2000, architect and Castle Village resident Thomas Navin petitioned to have the trivium declared a New York City Green Streets site. It was dedicated on August 4th, 2001, which would have been Dr. Paterno's 123rd birthday. The nonprofit group Friends of the Paterno Trivium are stewards of this tiny park's landscaping and semicircular bench, which is a very popular place to meet up with neighbors. Thank you very much for attending this presentation. I hope you have learned a thing or two about Dr. Paterno's castle. It has been a joy researching my great-grandparents' enchanting home. When Dr. Paterno consolidated the castle estate property in 1934 into one big lot, all prior historical records became more difficult to trace, especially online. Typically, when a building is demolished, such as the castle, the municipal records are also destroyed. But I have faith that the castle blueprints exist somewhere in a dusty city basement, and I'm determined to find them. My research continues, and my goal is to one day create a three-dimensional online virtual model and tour of the Paterno Castle. If you have any tips for me on where I should search for the historical castle records during my next visit to Manhattan, please reach out to me. If you would like to know more about this structure or any of the 164 Manhattan-based Paterno buildings, please visit my research website at paternoarchitecture.com. On my website is a contact link where you can email me at any time. Thank you again.